Okay, so show of hands, how many of you remember first playing Tetris back in the 80s and were like, gee, Tetris is fun, but I really wish it was in 3 dimensions? Well, for the 5 or 6 of you with your hands up, you can put them down because 1, I can't see you, and 2, this is pre-recorded, but in any case, today's ancient DOS game is Blockout. And as implied, it is effectively Tetris, but in 3 dimensions. Naturally, there isn't going to be a whole lot to talk about with this one, but I feel Blockout sometimes gets treated a little unfairly for a couple of reasons. The first is that yes, Blockout is a lot slower paced due to the nature of what you're doing, so it doesn't excite or thrill in the same way a standard 2D Tetris game would. Well, not without tweaking some things anyways. And the other thing too is that because of the sheer amount of screen space needed for the 3-dimensional aspect, there's not really any room left for interesting backgrounds or other things to dress up the experience. Visually, this game's a lot more sterile and functional than artistic, and whether that's a good or a bad thing depends on the person playing. As you're going to see though, there's a lot of depth here when you really look into it. And no, I'm not apologizing for the pun. Blockout was originally conceived by a person whose name I'm probably going to completely butcher, Aleksander Ustaszewski, working for the Polish company THREEEEEE, and was originally published by California Dreams in 1989, though a few of the console ports came later in 1991. Now, it's a one-player action/puzzle game with support for a variety of video modes, which were common at the time, but only supports PC speakers sound, and even then doesn't have a lot of it. As for its current release date, the current license holder of the Blockout trademark, Kadon Enterprises, allowed the game to become proper freeware sometime a number of years ago. And it's actually hard to figure out exactly when said permission was properly obtained, but in any case, if you want to get a copy of the game yourself, just head over to www.blockout.net, which is where you'll also find a download for Blockout 2, which is a sort of sequel made for Windows with the same feature set, but with modernized graphics and sound. If you want a physical copy, then you're going to find a very similar situation to the last game covered, where the console ports are way more common than the PC ports, but at least in this case, Blockout is just the more common game all around, with most copies going for between $5 and $10 loose and $15 and $20 fully boxed. However, given the sheer quantity of different systems this game was released for, finding the exact version you want can be a little tricky, especially when considering that most search systems try to autocorrect Blockout as Blackout. Well, one other interesting thing of note, that company I mentioned just a moment ago, Kadon Enterprises, has been around for a little over 40 years now and has owned the Blockout name almost that entire time. And when you go to their website, which I'll have a link to in the video description, it's like a massive trip back to the past, since despite being an active company still maintaining their website and posting updates, selling products and everything, it's styled very much like a late 90s internet site, and you'll notice that their product catalog is chock full of physical geometric puzzles, many of which are made out of either wood or acrylic pieces, and many of which also have free online versions you can play. Though, given that they're all Flash-based, it may be tricky to play the online versions nowadays. And hopefully they update them to run without Flash someday in the near future. Before starting a game of Blockout, you need to set up the playfield. By default, the game offers 3 pre-made settings called Flat Fun, 3D Mania, and Out of Control. Now, Flat Fun has a pit size of 5x5x12, that's 5 columns across horizontally, 5 rows down vertically, and 12 layers deep, and uses the flat set of blocks. 3D Mania has a pit size of 3x3x10 and uses the basic set of blocks, while Out of Control has a pit size of 5x5x10 and uses the extended set of blocks. Now, there's a lot to unpack here, so let's go over what exactly is going on. The gameplay takes place in a pit, which you look down into from above, and pieces will start falling in, always generating in the bottom left corner. The goal is to fill entire layers with cubes to make them disappear and score points, though you also earn extra points from dropping pieces, clearing multiple layers at a time, plus there's also an extra bonus for clearing the entire playfield, often called an all-clear award in Tetris variants nowadays. If the stack gets too high and a piece tries to spawn but there's no room for it, then it's game over. Naturally, since you're trying to fill a three-dimensional pit, things can end up going a lot slower than a typical 2D game of this nature. A standard Tetris grid, for instance, is 10 blocks across, and all of the shapes in Tetris are 4 blocks big, so making a line in Tetris is pretty quick. But here in Blockout, 2 of the 3 default game modes are 5x5, meaning to clear a layer requires 25 cubes to be filled in. And unless you're using the extended block set, many of the shapes which drop will only be singles, doubles, or one of the 2 possible triple block shapes. So it not only takes longer because of the quantity of cubes to fill in, but also because the shapes you're using are filling that space more slowly. However, you have quite a number of options for customizing this experience, as you can independently set the height and width of the pit to be as small as 3 or as large as 7, and can set the depth of the pit to be as little as 6 or as deep as 18 blocks. Now, these all have ramifications on how the game plays out. Plus, if you set the dimensions smaller than 5x5 by anything, it may limit what kinds of extended pieces are possible, given that all the pieces in the flat and basic block sets fit within 3x3 limits. Smaller widths and heights affect how much coverage is needed to clear each layer, thus the smaller these numbers are, the faster things will play out, but also the more easily things can go wrong, since you have fewer options for where to drop things. The depth ultimately affects how much you can screw up and still come out okay. The more shallow the depth, the fewer mistakes you can get away with before the stack hits the top. One thing that's really good about the game, though, is that every set of options you come up with is given its own high scores table. Though honestly, I was never really able to figure out exactly what's going on with the scoring, apart from just noticing what actions score points at all. Still, being able to track your scores and challenge yourself or your friends, regardless of how you set up the game, is nothing but a good thing. In fact, once you set things up, you can even engage a demo mode, which has the computer AI play through, and it's actually pretty competent, giving you a good measure as to how good or bad your settings are before trying it yourself. Though you unfortunately can't really use the AI to gauge scoring potential because the level number doesn't increase naturally during the demo mode, and the scoring is definitely higher with the higher level numbers. Now, I should probably talk about the differences between the 3 block sets, because it may not be obvious if you're just starting with this game. First, there's the flat set, which has these 8 polycubes to work with. Now, astute viewers are going to notice right away that almost every possible flat shape of polycube from 1 to 4 blocks is represented here, except for a straight 4 block long piece. And I have a funny feeling this was very intentional to avoid Tetris references, since getting 4 lines simultaneously in Tetris is literally called getting a Tetris. The irony, though, is that the Tetris name has been licensed for various Blockout remakes in the past, such as 3D Tetris on the ill-fated Virtual Boy. So despite starting out as 2 separate things, the 2 franchises have indeed intermixed at various points in history. The basic block set, on the other hand, only has 7 polycubes in play, only 1 of which is a triple, and the other 6 are all quadruples. But here, not all of the pieces are perfectly flat, and in fact, there's no straight pieces either. Given the lack of straight pieces and the shapes on offer, the most layers you can clear all at the same time are 3, and that's using the L-shaped piece. Then you have the extended block set, which contains a full mix of all of the flat and basic pieces together, and then all of these on top of that. Yeah, the extended set not only adds in the missing 4 block long piece, but every possible pentacube as well, making for a grand total of 41 different pieces that can drop, provided the pit is wide enough to fit them. If the pit dimensions are smaller than 5x5 in terms of width and height, then it will not generate the pieces which have possible rotations which do not fit inside. I should probably mention the controls. There's actually a handy help screen to demonstrate them, but they're really simple. The Q, W, and E keys all rotate pieces counterclockwise around the X, Y, and Z axes respectively. The A, S, and D keys rotate clockwise instead. The arrow keys move the piece around the pit, and spacebar drops the piece straight down. It can take a bit of getting used to given the sheer number of rotational controls at your disposal, but once you have the controls mastered, you can rotate pretty much any piece into any orientation you want very quickly. I should also note that Blockout was slightly ahead of the curve, as a feature seen in modern Tetris games known as lock delay can actually be seen here in Blockout. When you drop a piece here in Blockout, there's a very short delay once the piece touches down before it locks into place. If you move the piece during this delay, it cancels the drop and puts the piece back into its natural falling state, allowing you to continue to move it around until it locks at its normal rate, giving you time to push pieces under others in case you make mistakes that you need to recover from. Though on the higher speeds, this may only afford you 1 or 2 more spaces of movement, so you may not be able to fix huge mistakes, only small ones. In fact, that is one drawback to Blockout over a typical 2D game of Tetris, is that if you make a mistake, it's kinda hard to keep track of where it was, making mistakes difficult to fix and easy to forget about. In fact, there's another feature in play here which you probably didn't even realize was a feature, which helps with tracking this sort of thing, and that's the pit meter on the far left. Not only does this meter show you how tall the stack in the pit currently is, it also color codes each layer, so that when you're looking down into the pit, you can tell how high something is by its color. Now, the colors do repeat once it gets high enough, but if the stack's getting that high at all, then repeating colors is probably the least of your worries. One last thing to quickly throw in too is that there's a practice mode which doesn't allow you to make high scores, but allows you to try out the settings you've chosen without having the pieces automatically descend. They don't drop until you tell them to, which, yeah, that actually makes it a pretty decent way to practice things. It's so nice to be able to do one of these sections again. For the past couple years, a lot of the DOS games on the show are games I'm playing for the first time ever, meaning I have no past history and thus no experience to draw from to give tips on how to succeed. But I first played Blockout on the Sega Genesis back when the game was brand new on the console in 1991, thus I have a bit of history with this game and a number of helpful tips for anyone wanting to give this one a try. My first tip is to set the rotation speed to slow until you have this game mastered, which can be done from the screen, which lets you custom configure the pit size and block set. And once you do have the game mastered, set the speed to medium, but do not set it to fast. See, here's the thing. This game has 3 rotation speeds, slow, medium, and fast. The slow setting lets you visually see the pieces rotate, which makes it much easier to visualize their shape and positioning in your mind, and thus makes it much easier to figure out where you can drop them. The medium setting kinda lets you do this, but it's much faster and thus ideal for snapping pieces into place as fast as you can. As for the fast setting, it's instantaneous. No animation of the pieces rotating whatsoever. Now, technically, the fast setting is optimal if you want to go really fast, except for one little problem. This setting doesn't just change the rotation speed, it also affects the drop speed. With the slow and medium settings, you will get lock delay going on, so that you can adjust pieces for a split second after they land. But the fast setting not only drops in an instant, but gives you no lock delay, meaning to slide a piece under another to correct a mistake, you have to wait for it to descend low enough, and on earlier levels, this can take a very long time. My second tip is to try and avoid scattering your progress in terms of filling in layers. Try to fit everything together so that very little pokes upwards, and so that you have as few holes as possible. The less scattered you do everything, the more flat area you'll have for dropping down pieces when you have no idea what to do with them. This is especially important when playing with the extended block set. My third tip is that if you plan to set yourself up to clear multiple layers at a time, put the hole for your straight piece in the bottom left corner. And the simple reason why is because that's where all the new pieces spawn in. Thus, the hole to drop the piece into will be right under where the piece spawns, making it fast and easy to get those layers cleared when the time comes. My fourth tip actually carries over from Tetris, in that if you have to make a move which forces you to create a gap underneath a piece with no easy way to correct it, just keep playing as you normally would and try to fill in what's left of that layer as best as you can. You won't clear it, but when you ultimately start clearing the layers above it, you'll have a greater chance of reaching a point where you can correct the mistake once the layers above have been stripped away. My fifth tip, specifically when working with the extended block set, is to avoid going for 5-layer clears unless your pit is very deep and at the maximum width and height of 7x7. Remember, you're working with 41 different pieces, and only one of those 41 pieces is able to clear 5 layers at a time, meaning it has a very low chance of showing up at all. Now, I did some manual measuring of the randomization, and I can confirm all pieces have an equal chance of showing up. But what that means is that you'll only get, on average, a single straight 5-block long piece for every 186 cubes placed on the playfield. Even with a 6x6 playfield where each layer fits 36 cubes, you will be filling up 5 layers slightly faster than the rate you'll be getting straight 5 block long pieces at, which means the strategy is ultimately doomed to fail. And heck, it'll fail even faster if the pit is only 5x5 wide. Instead, I find the best strategy is to keep a hole going in the bottom left corner, and any time you get a straight piece of any length, drop it in there to clear some layers, provided you have any layers otherwise filled and ready to clear. This way, 5 of those 41 different pieces will be able to knock the stack down a bit, making it far more likely you'll survive to see the faster speeds. And my final tip has to do with when things start spiraling out of control due to the steadily increasing speed as the level number goes up, in that you get points for every piece dropped. So to keep the points flowing when you know you're about to lose, just try to get all the pieces out of the way of the bottom left corner. The game doesn't end until a piece attempts to spawn and intersects a cube in the pit when it tries. So the less cluttered you can keep the bottom left corner of the pit up to the end, the longer it takes to reach that end, and thus the more points you will get just from surviving at all. And on the higher speeds, those extra points can add up fast. Overall, I enjoy Blockout because it's a much stronger mental workout than Tetris. Well, no, it's not as action-packed or as subliminally gratifying since everything is much more slower paced, but it gives you the chance to think about your moves to a much greater degree, and in 3 dimensions. Now obviously this game isn't for everyone, but if you like action puzzle games and haven't ever tried this one, then it's definitely worth a shot, especially since both it and its modern remake are both freeware now. Conversely, if you like what you see but want to strip the action out entirely, and have access to a VR headset, a similar game I would recommend taking a look at is called Cubism, which is a VR game where you're given large shapes made out of cubes which you have to fill with smaller polycubes. It has no time limits, calming music to keep the pace, and is minimalist in all the right ways for these sorts of puzzles, plus can still get pretty darn challenging in its later stages. So Blockout does technically run fine with the auto or max cycle settings under DOSBox, but only the raw gameplay, not the audio. To get both the audio working right while maintaining as high a frame rate as possible, you need to set a fixed cycles count, and it needs to be fairly precise. I ended up with a cycle setting of 4,000, which seemed to offer the best balance between getting the sound correct and keeping things rotating as smoothly as possible. Set it slower and you get a lot more lag, set it higher and the sound starts glitching up. Now, I only tested that out with the EGA 640x350 mode though. You may need different cycles counts for the other video modes to keep the speed and sound balanced properly. Anywho, that's all for today's episode of Ancient DOS Games. Next up in 2 weeks, on Saturday, August 14th, will be another review, episode 289, and we're going to be taking a look at one of the most influential 3D dungeon crawls ever to grace PCs in the early 90s, to the point where even some modern dungeon crawls take after it. Plus, it'll be my first time playing it, so I kinda expect to be slaughtered mercilessly. So make sure you tune in to witness the carnage. Thanks for watching, everyone, and extra special thanks to those of you supporting me on Patreon. Here's just a small set of you guys.